Well, hello, and welcome to another SOLAS webinar. For those of you followers, you will know that at the SOLAS Centre for Public Christianity, we do one of these webinars about once a month, looking at a kind of live contemporary issue, something to do with the Christian faith in the 21st century. And today we have a really exciting topic for you, and I'm very, very thrilled to be joined by a very special guest to help us think about issues around faith and science and design. I would love to welcome to the screen, to the webinar, Professor David Galloway. David, how are you doing?
Yeah, pretty good. Thanks, Andy. Great to be with you.
Oh, it's great to have you. And for those who don't know, David, your kind of CV is a kind of pretty kind of lengthy one. You've been a consultant surgeon. You are still an honorary professor of surgery at the University of Glasgow, and until recently, you were president of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Glasgow. So I guess you had the job of keeping lots of doctors in order, right? That was your responsibility, organising them, or was it?
Well, maybe I erroneously thought that about the role at the time, but I suspect those who were on the other side of the fence probably had a somewhat different view of my role and responsibility. But it was a great privilege, actually, to do that. And it was 3 years of wonderful networking with people and opportunity to share ideas and so on. It was a great highlight, really, in my career.
And of course, as well as a medic and a scientist with say that sort of long kind of CV behind you, you're also an author. You've written, well, I was going to say 2 books, but of course we're about to talk about the third. The first one of yours I remember reading was Controlled Chaos, which is a great title for a book, and in fact describes my bookshelves actually, and my study, my wife would say. And then the other one of yours I remember reading is this one here, Follow the Science. But you've got a third one out, which we're going to talk about today, Design Dissected, all of them looking kind of issues around faith and science. And so I suppose the first question I have for you, David, is why the need to write? I mean, particularly the latest book, Design Dissected, why the need to write generally? I mean, many people would say, you've got a glittering scientific career. Why do you feel the need to dabble in the whole science and faith thing? What's led you to start writing, and particularly this latest book that we're going to focus a bit on in this webinar?
Yeah, good question. I think there are probably 2 reasons that spring to mind. Number one was out of a sense of frustration. And that sense of frustration comes mainly from the fact that throughout my career, I've had some interest in issues of faith and science, and particularly when it comes down to origins and the causation of things. And so many of my colleagues used to frustrate me just by accepting the kind of default paradigm, the kind of current thinking, well, it's all just as a result of, the Big Bang and natural processes and Darwinian evolution, and, that is the explanation. And I've never found that to be a particularly satisfactory set of explanations, particularly when you then begin to look in a little bit more detail at the evidence. And the second reason, I think, is also important, because I come at this unashamedly from a Christian angle. And I just feel that so many Christians, when it gets into that arena of thinking about faith and science, they kind of feel as if they're on the back foot, they're on the defensive right away. They almost have a sense that, the sort of scientific worldview, which holds this kind of default position, has all the answers and so on. And actually, nothing could be further from the truth. And it's only when you begin to scratch under the surface and begin to challenge some of these ideas that a completely different narrative springs to mind. And so that was really these 2 reasons kind of stimulated me to put this book together.
Now, one story I remember you telling me when we first met a few years ago, which would be great if you would be willing to kind of share it with the viewers, David, is that when you came to the end of your tenure as the president there, you get to give a kind of final lecture, a final kind of speech to all of your peers and all these other eminent medics and scientists. And, people will often sort of present on some aspect of science or some new discovery, I suppose, or experiment they've been working on or whatever. But you picked a fairly unusual topic, and that sort of lecture, which I think is still available on YouTube, sort of went a bit viral. What did you do in your final address to the Royal College?
Yeah, so one of my colleagues in the college said, it's a tradition in the college for the outgoing president to give a kind of valedictory lecture. And it was a a named lecture for a one-time librarian of the college, a fellow called Finlayson. So this Finlayson lecture emerged on my agenda. And so I simply asked, well, what's the lecture to be about, And they said, well, you can choose any topic you like. So that was fantastic. And rather than giving a sort of clinical summary of my career or some particular hot topic that I felt would be of interest, I thought it would be good just to get into this territory because the book that I've produced, actually, the subtitle is the Design Real? And so many people think the design is just illusory, you see. And when you look for design in life, you can see it pretty much everywhere. And so I thought, here is an opportunity to get into and challenge the kind of naturalistic thinking that so many of my colleagues just kind of accept without necessarily delving into it in any detail. So I decided to try and conceal the title just mischievously, really, and I dressed it up with a somewhat presumptuous Latin title called Enigmata ad infinitum. And of course, they said, well, what's this all about? And of course, I refused to tell them too much detail until it came to the delivery of the actual event. And it was really on the strength of working up that lecture, beginning to assemble all this evidence and the material that I presented on that occasion at the end of 2018. And then when it was released and others began to see it, many people said to me, look, you've got to get this down in print and try and expand this into a book-length treatise. And so that's basically what I've done. It's not a long book. It's probably a couple of 100 pages, 250 pages, something like that. But it does begin to just explore into some of these areas that I covered in that lecture.
But so, David, let's just keep it on the focus of the science and faith question. That one of the things that I often hear from atheist friends, and maybe there are folks watching this webinar who this would be their reaction, would say, come on, what are we talking about here? I mean, to go, you've come from the world of science, David. You surely know this full well. That science can explain everything, or if it can't explain anything, it soon will. It does seem to be that science continually advances, and especially it advances into things where religion once held sway. Human beings once thought that, the lightning flashed because it was the gods throwing lightning bolts. We know that's not the case. We once thought God was responsible for a whole range of things, but science has now discovered what those are. So, surely religion is ebbing away and eventually will be no more. Science is expanding. It can answer any question we throw at it. Why are we still having this conversation?
Yeah, okay. So this is a commonly held view, and in fact, it's articulated even by some very significant scientific thinkers who would tell you that science pretty much does explain everything. Well, in the book, I've referred to two people who've kind of tackled that question. One of them is Bertrand Russell, and the other is Peter Meadower. Now, Bertrand Russell, interestingly enough, is an individual who basically said that whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods. And what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. Now, that's a very interesting claim. And actually, Russell was a brilliant individual. He was a man who had a great deal of prowess as a philosopher, as a mathematician, as a bit of a social critic as well. He was a man who was well accepted by society in general. And this is his quote. I'll just stick it up on the screen. There's the quote right there. Whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods. Now, you just look at that for a second. That's one of these statements which actually is self-defeating. It's self-refuting. Because whatever his prowess and logic might have been, his logic deserted him when he wrote that sentence, because what he wrote there is actually not sustainable by any scientific understanding, and so it's essentially meaningless. And the other individual that I have a great deal of respect for is this fellow here. This is Sir Peter Meadower. Actually, my whole working life was pretty much spent in Glasgow, and Peter Meadower came to Glasgow as a biologist to do some work on transplant immunology. And in fact, together with a famous Glasgow surgeon, one of my predecessors in the Royal College, a fellow called Professor Tom Gibson, who was a plastic surgeon, they worked on elements of transplant immunology to really advance that whole scene. And they described what became known as the second set phenomenon. We don't need to go into that, but Meadower was a great thinker as well. And one of the things that he said was quite interesting. He said the existence of a limit to science is made clear by its inability to answer childlike elementary questions having to do with first and last things. You know, the very questions you've just mentioned, Andy. You know, where do we come from? What are we here for? Surely science has answered these. Well, he says no. These questions like, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What's the point of living? Actually, science can get to the how questions quite well, but it gets nowhere near the why questions. And they just seem to be in a completely different category. There's another fellow who, in my world, is really roundly praised as a tremendous contributor and thinker, and that is Francis Crick. And Francis Crick said a couple of things that are pertinent to this as well. He said, you know, almost all aspects of life are engineered at the molecular level, and without understanding molecules, we can only have a very sketchy understanding of life. No, that's fair enough. That's not controversial. But then what he said in that same article, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. So you'll probably see a slightly incoherent juxtaposition of these ideas. Engineered, but not designed. So what on earth is going on there? How can it be engineered and not designed? And you know, I think Meadower was right. No matter where you look, you see evidence of design, whether it's an architectural design. I had some pictures of the Louvre and other weird and wonderful buildings to show you. We look at a building, we instantly recognize that it's been designed and engineered. So how come Crick could come out with a statement like that? Well, the reality, of course, is that there are a whole range of things that science just cannot get close to. And I've listed some of them on this slide. So, for example, there's the idea of mathematical and logical truth. Science has to presuppose maths and logic, but it can't prove that mathematical and logical truth is actually truth. And the whole idea of the sort of ultimate reality claims, you know, metaphysical claims, some of which I've referred to in Design Dissected as well. You know, the questions about origin and about meaning and so on, and about the possibility there might be other minds other than my own. Or what about business, or the business of justice or ethics, or statements of value, or just as good and evil can't easily subject itself to scientific analysis, neither can beauty. So, you know, abstract and aesthetic experience. And the strangest thing of all, Andy, is this, that even science itself cannot be sustained by the scientific method. Because for science to work, there has to be two requirements, essentially. There has to be, number one, a system of reasoning, and we've talked a little bit about that. But secondly, there has to be a universe that, to allow us to draw valid conclusions about things, it needs to behave in an orderly and a predictable way. And of course, the reality is that it's question begging to assume that what will happen in the future will always be like what has happened in the past. So, as I sometimes say, just because the future has been like the past in the past doesn't guarantee that the future will be like the past in the future. And so it just cannot be proven by that kind of experience. And any attempt to do it argues in a circle. So there are very strict limitations to science, and I'm quite certain that Meadower got that absolutely right.
That's some really kind of helpful thoughts in there, David. David, you mentioned design, and of course your most recent book, Design Dissected. And of course, the word design is a little bit of a trigger word sometimes for some. I know many atheists get quite nervous about it. You quoted Francis Crick, and then of course Richard Dawkins, famous atheist biologist from Oxford University, once described biology. He said biology is the study of complicated things that give the impression of being designed. So look, I suppose my question for you is, design is obviously a key part of what you've written about and thought about. What would you say then to somebody, who's at the more skeptical end of the discussion, who would just really lean on that impression part? David, you're getting fooled by the power of evolution. Evolution has the ability to, through small incremental changes, to produce structures and functions that look like they're designed, but they're not. It is just an illusion. It is just an impression. What would you say in response?
Well, huge question. And when you begin to delve into questions of causality and evolution and so on, we have to be very clear in our terms, first of all. So I have no doubt that at one level, things change over time. That's very obvious that that's the case. The question I reckon that's more important to try and dig into is whether or not what we see and understand in the natural world, could it actually have developed by the kind of processes and mechanisms that are generally considered to be the answer to this question? Is it possible that all of this just happened as some natural process without any guidance or without any direction or without any design? And the conclusion I draw is very simple, because when you try and look at that mechanism and you match it against what you see in reality, it just doesn't cut it. It doesn't make sense, and it falls apart on a number of levels. Let me just maybe try and illustrate this with a little story. So some years ago, I spent some time in Africa and delivered this baby by cesarean section. Now, I'm not an obstetrician, and that was one of babies are the slipperiest customers, as you can appreciate. But there were elements of this particular story which really stood out for me and got me thinking about this whole bizarre business. Because what happened on that occasion was that this young mother who gave birth to this baby, they both were well eventually, but the mother lost a serious amount of blood. She had a postpartum hemorrhage, and it was so severe that it knocked out part of the function of her pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary is responsible, complicated business, but it's responsible for a whole series of hormones. So let me just show you a diagram of what that looks like. There is the pituitary in the middle of the screen, and it produces all these hormones. They've all got labels like TSH and ACTH and all the rest of it. And there they go, a whole range of them. And they produce essentially controlling chemical messengers that will regulate the function of these various organs, the thyroid, the adrenal, the gonads. It will help with growth and development. It controls breast milk production and all the rest of it. Now, it's this hormone prolactin that produces breast milk that was missing in this young woman's case. And I began to just appreciate how critical it was for the whole of this system to work. And when you look at it, it's got to work out of the box. So what you're looking at is something which is beautifully balanced, integrated. There are levels of control which almost defy belief. There are all these 7 or 8 hormones that are produced. And of course, they're all controlled to the extent that you have a system which has what we call homeostasis. In other words, it maintains its internal environment. And when you look at the reason that works, what you see typically is that there's a system of feedback, negative feedback. So when a particular hormone is overproduced or is surplus to requirements, it switches off the releasing structures and the releasing hormones and stimulating hormones that lead to its production in the first place. And so there's this curious balance, and this applies for virtually all of these hormones. Not only that, there's even a situation where in childbirth, for example, there's positive feedback. So during labor, oxytocin is the little chemical messenger that drives uterine contraction. And as the baby descends into the pelvis, the contractions become more and more powerful and so on. And the result of that is a positive feedback mechanism until the baby is finally born. So you've got this amazing balance. Now, for that to have developed step by step by step, with each little advantage being selectable, it just doesn't make sense, because you've got to have a working system out of the box. In other words, it's all got to be pretty much operational, or it's not going to work properly at all. And that actually applies to all of the endocrine organs. And you can summarize them. There's a whole host of them here. And that degree of balance and integration, that degree of what sometimes is called irreducible complexity, or what is perhaps now a better term, the sort of purposeful arrangement of all these things is just absolutely staggering. And it got me thinking also, I mean, I hadn't really thought too much about, you know, what happens, for example, I've described this in the book as well, the amazing things that go on when a baby is born. So a baby in the womb, I mean, the whole question of embryology is just fascinating and intricate, incredibly designed. I mean, you can't almost ever draw a different conclusion that design has been involved in that process. But it's what happens at the final moments when the baby is born that kind of attracted my attention. So let me show you another diagram. So here's a diagram which shows what circulation looks like on the left there with the placenta. The placenta is at the bottom of the screen, and the baby derives its oxygen and nutrients from the mother's circulation indirectly via the placenta. And what has to happen at the time of birth is that the placenta, of course, is suddenly switched off. It's suddenly no longer there. And there are several systems that have to change, not quite in the blink of an eye, but certainly in the process of a few seconds or minutes, or at most a few hours, or the baby's dead. It doesn't get oxygen, it gets starved of oxygen, and it fails to survive. And of course, there's no one watching this webinar right now that hasn't navigated that process completely. Now, no one has been able to properly explain, A, that is somehow some random process that has produced that. It seems incredible that that's the case. Or B, actually, the whole question of it being gradually formed just again fails. It's this business of a system that has to work out of the box that makes it very difficult to see how you could possibly argue for a gradual process. And of course, that applies at the molecular level as well. And we could get into all sorts of examples, but these are two, one at organ level, one at a structural anatomical level, where you get these shunts that have to close off or the baby is dead meat. And it's just amazing to see that some people will try and explain that away and say, well, actually, there's a Darwinian process that accounts for that. No wonder our colleagues in evolutionary biology held a conference at the end of 2016, which was actually held in the Royal Society of all places. And some of these very questions came to the fore at that time about the inadequacy of the current dogma, if you like, the current neo-Darwinian synthesis, as it's sometimes called, or the modern synthesis to explain these things. They clearly recognize its inadequacy, and they're looking for another naturalistic process, but they're looking for a different mechanism that would perhaps better explain how some of these things came to be. The evidence of design is, it seems to me, pretty obvious.
This is fascinating stuff, David, and we'll go show gives people some information on how they can get hold of that book of yours when we come to this end of this part of the webinar and move into some Q&A. But David, one of the things that struck me as you talked about that, and as I read your book and as I've thought about some of these issues myself, there's this word, we don't use it in everyday life. It's a complicated sounding word, but it means a fairly simple thing. The idea of teleology, that something is pointed towards something. It's got a design, an intentionality, you know, and just as you know, as key is designed to turn in a lock, so that system you've described is designed to do something. The other place I think this pops up that is fascinating, and I would love to get your thoughts on, pardon the pun, would be when it comes to thinking. Because, of course, to do science in the first place, you have to use your mind. You just shared some pretty heady ideas with us kind of right now. And I find it fascinating because we don't often stop and think about what's going on when we are thinking and communicating and wrestling with ideas. But there seems to be an intentionality to the way our brains are designed too, that enable us to pursue truth, to experience consciousness and all kinds of things. Am I onto something there? Are there similar sort of questions that one might ask around mind and thinking and consciousness?
Yeah, no, you definitely are onto something there. I mean, just before we leave the kind of physiology behind, one of the things that just strikes me as unbelievable, unless you actually see it for yourself, is the way that people will rapidly adopt the notion and accept the notion that you can have a whole range of complexity, specified complexity, in the form of a language. So take, for example, the way that DNA works. And again, we go into that in a little bit of detail in the book. And when you begin to explore that, you realize that what you're looking at there is essentially text. It's a kind of a language. And it raises a couple of questions. Well, where does the information come from? Where does the specification come from? It has to be coded. It has to be designed. There is never a language that doesn't arise from an intelligent source. So that's an important factor, I think, to make. And the second thing, of course, is, well, for the DNA to do the coding and to code for protein production, for example, it needs protein. It needs protein to manufacture and to replicate the DNA. So which came first, the chicken and the egg? And there's a similar scenario when it comes to consciousness. So when we're thinking about consciousness, there are all these different elements that we associate with brain states or mind states. You know, we have sensation, we have perception, we have imagination, and all the things that are mentioned there on the screen. But the question that I pose to some extent in the book is, how do you figure out which of these are actually just related to the physical world out there and are not necessarily about anything? Whereas if you look at things that are truly mind states, where do ideas come from? Where does desire or will or intellect emerge from? And of course, that is a huge problem which has exercised neuroscientists and philosophers for generations. Even old René Descartes, there he is, with his famous, I think, therefore I am. And it was this question of thinking and understanding thinking which was so difficult for people to understand. And so I got into this whole business. I mean, the business of consciousness is something which is of deep interest to a surgeon, of course, because we don't like patients wriggling around on the table when we're trying to do unpleasant things to them. And so when you look at the history of anesthesia and its development, that actually led to a whole explosion of understanding of the way the brain works and the way the mind works. But the critical thing is this, physical stuff is not about anything. There is no intentionality there. Whereas human beings, we have will, ideas, intentionality. There's a definite aboutness which is built into consciousness. This idea that you can be self-aware, that there's a kind of movie running in your head, that you can communicate with other people at a conscious level, this is all fascinating. And from a materialistic point of view, no one has come close to explaining this. David Chalmers is a philosopher whose work I'm sure you're familiar with, Andy, who has characterized this as the easy problem of consciousness, where you can kind of pin particular neurological phenomena to particular areas of brain function. But he has much, much more difficulty in beginning to understand things such as the quality of things, qualia, and intentionality and aboutness and will and so on. So these have proved to be beyond materialist. And there are many, many materialists or atheists who have grappled with this. And they've come to the conclusion that the standard dogma that everyone seems still to be taught just doesn't quite cut it. And so, people like Thomas Nagel and others have made this very point, that it looks like there must be design of some sort, some teleology in there in the background. That's basically what teleology. I mean, there's a wonderful quote of the famous biologist from way back, JBS Haldane, and I stole this quote for the book, and he said this: teleology, design, is like a mistress to a biologist. He can't live without her, but he's unwilling to be seen with her in public. And that's about how it stands.
That's a wonderful sort of metaphor there. So David, begin drawing some of the threads together here, because we're coming up towards sort of half an hour. We want to have then open it up for some questions. We've been busy soliciting questions on social media for the last few days or so, and I think we have some real corkers for you. But really, I think all you said about design and purpose, teleology, and mind and everything, really, to me, forces the issue, doesn't it? So it seems to me we've got two choices here. Either somehow we've got to somehow sort of, patch materialism in such a way that it will work, or we just don't, or we embrace materialism, don't ask the awkward questions, as you say, JBS Haldane's playing in that area, or we're going to have to, we need a different worldview here. And of course, I know what you would say on this, but I suppose, some final thoughts for us, and particularly for those listening who are intrigued but maybe not convinced. Why are you convinced that really, it's in one sense is a no-brainer that theism is a massively better explanatory mechanism than materialism. Because I know sometimes I've come across atheists who've said to me, "Okay, well, all right, you've raised some questions for me, but just because materialism has some difficulties doesn't therefore automatically mean the answer is theism. It could be something else." So why do you think that theism is the most persuasive explanation for some of what you've talked about today?
Yeah. Well, when you think about ultimate reality, this goes back to the Leibniz question: why is there something rather than nothing? Either something produced it or nothing produced it. Now, if you want to hold to materialist position, then you have to take the view that nothing is responsible, essentially, for everything that we see around us, for ultimate reality. And the way that I sometimes characterize it, I mean, there are not many options here. It's one or the other. It's essentially a worldview question. And the way that I see it is this: it's either a materialistic view or a theistic view. I don't think there's another third option that's particularly satisfactory. And actually, these two are fundamentally different. I would argue that one is supported by the evidence, the other is not. So for materialist, matter and energy is primary. For the theist, God is the cause of everything, and God produces matter and energy. For the materialist, the whole idea of matter and energy must somehow give rise to the notion that well, God appeared on the scene. So one is clearly bottom up and the other is top down. So they could not be more different. But I think if you want to be a materialist, that's fine. I often say that people can believe anything they like. I would just encourage them to make sure that what they believe is actually correct, it's true. And when you think about it that way, here is the cost of believing that the whole thing arose from some naturalistic process. You have to explain everything from nothing, life from non-life, the fine-tuning that we see that we haven't really touched on today from randomness, the information in biology and DNA, 3 billion bits of information. You know, you would look at a written sentence and recognize the intelligent agency behind it on the basis of perhaps just a few words. And yet we've got all this wealth of information that we somehow just have to imagine has emerged by chance out of chaos. Or consciousness from unconsciousness. Rocks are not conscious. People are conscious. Where on earth did that come from? Is it just simply, as Crick said, you know, the sort of firing of your neurons and somehow consciousness emerges? Reason from non-reason even. Now, for all of these reasons, it seems to me that coming down to a theistic worldview. Now, you might say, well, you're a Christian and therefore you're going to end on that note in any event. Well, what I've tried to do is to write a book which is not a Christian book, but it's a book written for people who are skeptical, who are willing to have a look at the evidence and to weigh up these two worldviews. And I think that I've made an argument which is fairly persuasive that the only sensible, non-preposterous position that you can take is to give theism an airing and to say, well, actually, it looks like that God did it is a far better explanation than anything that you can come up with from following the evidence where it leads. So that's essentially how it lands. I've deliberately not written a book which has lobbed Bible verses in there. I'm very happy to talk about the authenticity of Scripture and so on. That's another argument. But I'm just a little bit concerned that some of my colleagues, you know, if you start to go down that track, they'll instantly stop listening to anything else you have to say. What I've tried to therefore do is to produce the evidence, tie it together, assemble the argument, and that's in essence what Design Dissected is about.
Yeah, and I think that can be a really helpful approach, David. I've got several friends who were former atheists who actually that was their journey to faith, was what you described there, was that coming to that recognition, you know, that materialism doesn't do enough explanation. And so that gets you onto the some kind of God question. And then you can begin fleshing out, you know, in further thinking, well, what kind of God are we talking about? Then you can look at some of those other questions. I think it can be helpful to separate those two pieces. The other thing I think that's immensely helpful in what you've just shared with us there is I think sometimes I think if you're coming from a very hyper skeptical background, you know, the whole kind of God idea can seem like a massive leap into the dark and maybe too much. But when you compare it and say, well, look at what you're comparing the options here. You're either saying God did it or you're saying nothing did it.
Yes.
There isn't another kind of medium in there somewhere. So you have to ask yourself which requires the greater credulity.
Yeah.
And I actually think, it takes much more, I don't like to say faith to be an atheist, although Frank Turek has written a book with that very title, but it does take a lot. David, you've walked us through all kinds of things, so this has been incredibly helpful. We're going to move in a minute into a time of Q&A for our last 20 minutes. For the last week or so, we've been asking people on social media to vote on a whole variety of questions we put to them, and also submit questions, and it's been great to see the engagement. Thank you to all of you who did that. But before we dive into that, just a quick plug for David's book. You'll find details about David's book in the show notes with this webinar. But David's book, Dissected, is a brilliant book, and we have some copies to give away at SOLAS. And the way we often do that is that SOLAS is supported. The reason we can have these kind of conversations about faith and culture and the big questions is we have a vast array of friends across the country who give us a small amount of money each month to make this possible. We live in a world where we're familiar with that. Lots of podcasts and YouTube channels run on that kind of sort of viewer-led, viewer-supported format. And that's what we do at SOLAS. So if you have enjoyed watching this webinar and SOLAS's other content, you can go to our website, and there'll be a slide coming up in a minute to show you how to do that. And you can sign up for as little as £3 a month. You can give more if you want, but you honestly don't need to do that. £3 a month is lovely. And as a thank you, we will send you a copy of David's book, Dissected. And if you're a Christian, you want to do that, great. If you don't have any faith, but you're just interested in these kind of conversations, feel free to support us as well. It was interesting. I was saying to David before the show that a few years ago, when a group of atheists got together in London and put together a bus with some big adverts for atheism on the side, one of my friends, a very committed Christian, actually chipped into that campaign because he thought having that bus drive around London with that slogan on the side would start so many conversations at bus stops. So you don't need to be a Christian to support SOLAS. You just need to think that actually conversations about faith and the big questions of life are important, particularly in the age that we live. So go check out the SOLAS website, and that's there for you. And also on the SOLAS website, you can also sign up for the SOLAS mailing list, email list, and we will then let you know of further conversations like this. We try and have these kind of webinars once a month or so with interesting and fascinating people. And so if you sign up for our mailing list, we will send you details of everything that is coming down the line. But David, now to the questions. So we asked people, we told people who you were and what you'd be talking about, and we asked folks what kind of questions they might have, and we got some good ones. So the first question I have for you, David, right at the end, you said, we haven't talked about the Bible, but I am happy to talk about the Bible, which is good, because the first question that somebody submitted on social media and then others kind of liked it, so it was clearly had some traction, was the whole question of how do we make sense of the Genesis account? You've given some quite sophisticated material today. Some of those slides, they made me go a bit sweaty and reminded me of, studying biology when I was 17 and sort of struggling with the sciences. But amazing stuff. But then we have the book of Genesis that seems to say God did it all in 7 days. It seems quite simplistic, almost sort of pre-scientific. How do we reconcile those two things together? You obviously do believe in Genesis, you believe in the Bible, you're also an eminent scientist. How do you square that particular circle? Yeah,
it's always interesting to me why this question comes up time and time again, and it's understandable that people are perplexed about that. It's very difficult, I think, just to avoid the notion that there seems to be a huge discrepancy here. In reality, I don't think there is such a huge discrepancy for a couple of reasons. Number one, Genesis is seen at least largely as a historical document, but I do not understand from the text that there is necessarily a commitment that you need to take it on in an extremely literal way. So, for example, the way that I've heard this discussed is that you've got to look at the kind of literature this is, the audience to which it was directed, and the kind of culture that existed at the time. And when you factor that in, you begin to see something against the kind of cultural background that might give you a completely different idea than just reading this as if it were written as some kind of, journalistic or historical account blow by blow, which I don't think actually makes sense. I don't think we're really committed either necessarily from the text itself, although some people would disagree with this, to take the day as a literal consecutive 24-hour day. I don't think it does give us any good, meaningful information about the age of the earth, for example, which is another hot topic. And all I would say is this: look, there are Christians with a very high view of Scripture who will fall on different sides of this question. In fact, I remember coming across a document on the web. I think it was published by the Presbyterian Church of North America, if I'm not mistaken, and they had listed and actually laid out in some detail something like 26 or 27 different approaches to an understanding of Genesis 1 through 11, and particularly Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. So there's a huge debate within the sort of Christian scene, but I don't think that this is something which runs counter to a modern scientific understanding. It may be that, of course, some of the elements of our scientific understanding will change and have to adjust as time goes by as well. So I think the truth is in there somewhere.
Yeah, and just on that very point you made about how, exactly how one reads the text there, if whoever asked that question or those who kind of were drawn to it on social media want to dig a bit further into that, a few webinars back last year, we had another eminent scientist. We had Professor John Lennox from Oxford University. And John, like David, has written kind of widely on faith and science issues. And John's written a wonderful little book called 7 Days That Divide the World, which really just explores that particular question. So do if you've enjoyed listening to David, do go and listen to John. And actually then you can have an Irishman and a Scotsman and an Englishman, actually, which is, we just need a Welshman and we've got the whole set. So no, David, thank you for that. Second question that we had that I think might maybe sort of be great for you to tease out a little bit more detail on the design stuff that you talked about. Somebody said, look, isn't a lot of this talk about God and science just an example of God of the gaps? And so God of the gaps, for those who aren't familiar with that phrase, that's a sort of going, well, we can't currently explain something using science. So let's say that God did it, but probably in 20 years' time, science will have explained it and will have moved on. How is the design stuff that you've mapped out not that? I don't think it is, but I could see how somebody might say, we don't currently know how some of these systems you described evolve, but we will do. We will do one day. So yes, push back a little bit on that accusation that this is just a sophisticated God of the gaps argument. Yeah. So a common question which comes up and clearly perplexes some people. Essentially, the God of the gaps argument is an argument from ignorance. So it basically says we don't understand this, therefore God must have done it. That is completely different from the kind of argument I've been making today, because I've been making an argument from knowledge. And the argument runs like this. Look, we can see evidence of design. We can understand how this thing fits together. We can appreciate that what we have is a purposeful arrangement of parts, or we can appreciate that what we have here is a series of specified, complex, language-like information. And what we know is that to arrive at that conclusion, we must have some kind of agency to design it. In other words, it's an understanding from what we know. We're making a positive argument from knowledge, not an argument from ignorance. So that is, in essence, I think to use the God of the gaps accusation is a misunderstanding of the structure of the argument that a design theorist is putting forward. And it's as simple as that, really, Andy. That's very helpful. I've also found sometimes, if one wants to be a bit cheeky, you can also sometimes actually turn around occasionally to the atheist asking the question, depending on how it's being asked, and say, look, in atheism, there is also a naturalism of the gaps. Absolutely. If we're not careful, which is saying, well, we can't possibly conceive how this might be explained. David's laid all this data out, but we will be able to explain it. Why? Yeah. Well, because there is no God, and therefore we have to be able to explain it. So actually both sides need to watch, I think, gap arguments. I think yes. Or worse. One of my favorite phrases I learned in philosophy was epistemic humility, which is to, be willing to be humble and go, okay, this is a problem for my side. And I think right now, actually a lot of what you've shared is very tough for atheism, as you say, because we have all this data. Third question for you then, moving on to a slightly different direction. actually. Back to the Bible. Somebody's asked a question about miracles. So science, right? You've talked all about science. You are a scientist. You know how the scientific method works. You know, cause and effect, the things that are testable and repeatable and observable, all that kind of stuff. Well, then along comes the Bible, and of course it's chock full of miracles, whether it's the Old Testament or you look at the 4 biographies of Jesus there in the New Testament. Jesus turns water into wine, walks on water, raises the dead, so on and so forth. Surely somebody has asked, as a scientist, you know, you can't possibly entertain the idea of the miraculous. How can miracles and science fit together?
Okay. So, of course, the famous David Hume was the arch enemy of the kind of miracle argument, I suppose, by saying that there was never, ever going to be any credible witness that would be enough for him to accept that that's the case. And I suppose that was the very early pushback against the idea of miracles. I mean, it seems to me this is fairly straightforward in many respects, because I think, you know, however you arrive at a conclusion that God exists, and I've presented one way to approach that question today. There are other classical arguments, as you very well know, Andy, for God's existence, whether you're looking at fine-tuning or looking at, you know, ultimate causation, or the cosmological argument, or the moral argument, or even the ontological. I mean, there's all these various approaches to try and point that out. It seems to me that there's a cumulative, persuasive case for theism. Now, from my point of view, that essentially solves the problem. There is no doubt in my mind that the witness accounts of the miracles can be taken as reliable. I think, given the background that God is in control of things, it just solves the problem for me, because God can choose to feed in new information, as John Lennox would say, or construct things in a different way, or do something that's surprising or that's unnatural in some respect. It just solves the problem for me when you begin to appreciate that actually, if theism is true, the miraculous becomes a non-problem.
I think that's very helpful, and I would be inclined to agree with you. And I think sometimes people forget, of course, that the laws of physics, particularly, of course, they describe what happens if no one intervenes. When I talk about this in front of a live audience, I'll often use a real world illustration and say to the students, do you want to see a miracle? Take a sound like a tennis ball and say, what happens if I drop this ball? According to the law of gravitation, of course, it's going to fall and hit the ground. And then you do it and you catch it halfway down and it doesn't hit the ground because a free agent has intervened. And presumably, if God is real, God can intervene whenever he wishes to. David, I've got 2 more questions for you. And so this one actually takes us back to Genesis. So, which is great, because that is the book of the Bible that deals with origins and all of these big questions. Somebody has raised another question, this time about the Bible and Genesis, and particularly evolution. And they asked, look, doesn't evolution really disprove the kind of Christian, the biblical account of things? I mean, not least the book of Genesis doesn't mention evolution. It seems to imply that God just goes along, creating every species, boom, 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 as there is. But surely we know from, biology and science and so forth that, evolution is real, that species develop over time, whereas Genesis seems to have, God intervening specifically on every account. How can we possibly reconcile evolution in any shape or form in the book of Genesis? What say you? Okay.
So number one, let's just define our terms carefully here. So I've made the point already that evolution as change over time is something which is non-controversial. What is much more controversial and much more difficult to explain, and much more difficult to even appreciate that there's any mechanism to support it, is the idea that, number one, once life got going, and that's a separate issue in its own right, but once life got going, that from the very first universal common ancestor, the very first simplest possible cell that was in existence that began to self-replicate and so on, that we now have all the complexity and diversity of life. Now, there are huge issues with that discussion. And so I think it's far from settled that that is an adequate exploration, whether it's a Darwinian process or whether there's some other various mechanisms that might apply, and lots of other naturalistic mechanisms have come on the scene. But there are huge issues with it. So number one, the fossil record doesn't fit. Number two, The whole question of information hasn't been answered. Number 3, the business of integrated systems, irreducible complexity, or the purposeful arrangement of parts hasn't been addressed. And I suppose the biggest issue of all, in many respects, is the origin of the first life. Now, evolutionary theory just completely does an end run around that, says it's not something that's relevant. It's a totally relevant question, because unless you can get life from non-life, then you can't even get any kind of evolutionary process started. And there's a huge question about how that could possibly have happened. And even from our understanding, our positive understanding of the way that biomolecules are structured, the way that they interact, and the way that they operate together, the notion that this all kind of happens spontaneously is just a completely preposterous view in my estimation. And so for that reason, again, good evidence to cast serious doubt on the naturalistic big picture of abiogenesis through evolution to ultimately what we see around us today. And so I think that's one side of it. The other side of it is for people who say, well, surely God could have directed evolution. Well, I guess he could. I think there's a fundamental philosophical issue with that, because most people would regard the evolutionary process as being unguided. But if you're talking about a sort of theistic evolution position, or an evolutionary creationism position, as it's sometimes called, then you've got to have guidance in there. So how can something be guided and unguided at the same time? That seems to me to be incoherent. And so I don't accept the theistic evolutionary paradigm at all.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, David. One last question, because we want to try and keep this within the time limit, because we respect that people have busy lives. And also one last question, and a nice, kind of small question for you to end on. Actually, no, it's quite a good question that somebody has asked. That a lot of what you've shared and we've talked about today, as we said earlier, actually, I think sets up nicely for the idea. Okay, theism is more plausible than atheistic materialism, but the kind of material that you've shared today really only gets us to a sort of generic god of theism. It could even be the sort of great sort of watchmaker who winds up the clockwork of the universe and then disappears off, never to be seen again. You, of course, don't believe in that kind of God. You believe in the God of Christian theism, the God of the Bible, the God who stepped into history in the person of Jesus. How does one bridge that gap? So if someone is watching this and they're like, okay, I'm intrigued, what are the next steps to help somebody bridge that gap between that kind of generic God that you've described and the God of the Bible? Where does somebody go on that journey?
Yeah, no, great question. I think you referred to a book earlier on, which I think is a super book. I'm not sure I like the title quite so much, but I can see where he's going, and that is Frank Turek's book. I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And he actually takes that kind of logical stepwise progression and basically says, well, first of all, let's establish if truth is real, and he does that. And then he looks at the question of God's existence. Is God real? And I think that's kind of what we've been talking about today, one element of that whole discussion. And then he goes on to say, well, if God is real, then what kind of God are we dealing with here? What are the potential competing claims? And when you begin to look at Christian theism, which is the position that we have landed on here for very good reason, you begin to look at, for example, the authenticity of the Christian scriptures, and you begin to see just how authentic they are, and how well put together they are, and how coherent they are, how reliable they are. And so if truth exists and God exists and the Bible is authentic, then the message of the Bible has to be reckoned with. And you get then into issues of, well, what about the central character? What about the character of Jesus Christ? And what about the most important issue on which the whole edifice stands or falls, and that is the question of the resurrection. And we've been talking about an evidence base for most of the webinar so far. And actually, when you begin to look in some detail and challenge the evidence base for the resurrection, it actually stands up incredibly well. So I think it's not a huge leap of blind faith, not at all. And John Lennox has made this point, and I would echo this point. My appreciation and my acceptance of the Christian message is based on the strength of the evidence, the publicly available evidence for its position. And so that's how I bridge that particular gap. I don't think it's a huge problem, but it does mean that people need to be open-minded and they need to be ready to go and have a look at some of these issues in detail for themselves.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, David. And would heartily endorse that. I would say to folks watching, if that's where you're at, and hugely recommend take a look at the SOLAS website, particularly our short answers videos, where we talk about a lot of the different kind of evidences and things that make us that you can build on somewhat David's shared. And if you're watching this video and you're a Christian, you have a Christian faith, and you're nodding along, hugely encourage you to share this with your friends. This webinar is not really intended just for Christians to sit there and go, "Oh, isn't this great?" So we really do want to get this in front of people who are thinking about or would be open to kind of thinking about some of the bigger questions of life. So if you want to find out more about David's work, you can see his link, his website there on the caption there. Go to davidgalloway.co.uk. You can find out all about him and his various books and so forth. If you'd like to get a hold of a copy of Design Dissected, the book we've been talking around and about today, remember you can go to the SOLAS website and sign up to support SOLAS for £3 a month. If you want to get it that way, help us do more of this, produce more of this kind of content, and we will happily send you a copy of David's book for you to enjoy and to dig into. And other than that, it just falls to me to say, David, thank you so much for being with us today. We know that you are very busy, very much in demand as a speaker in your own right and a writer and everything else. So thank you for taking the time to be with us. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
And if you've enjoyed today's webinar, which I hope you have, we will be back in a month's time with a different guest and a different topic. And if you want to check out the previous webinars we've had covering a whole wide range of different issues with different guests from across the country and around the world, again, go to the SOLAS website. You can find all of our old webinars archived there, as this one will be. So if you've enjoyed this one and you do want to share it with a friend, you can find it there on the SOLAS website for posterity. So meanwhile, just falls to me to say goodbye. Hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. And I hope we've given you some real food for thought this afternoon. And we will see you next time. Goodbye.